My name is Clara Bergen. I'm a research fellow and a member of the research team. I specialize in analysis of video recorded clinical communication. And I'm going to be sharing a theme that was seen as really critical by the whole group. So this was ensuring that young people are centrally involved in decisions about their mental health, for example, decisions about treatment. And one of the members of our Young People's Advisory Group said this really well. I think it's probably good to start off with a quote. If a young person and practitioner don't have an open discussion about goals for treatment and the young person's preferences, they may end up working against each other throughout the duration of treatment and may make little to no progress. So we also tend to see that often since our video recordings that we work with are of emergency care assessments, we often tend to see that as well. So for healthcare practitioners, professionals in education and social services, and even parents, this tends to involve three important steps. So first, asking for the young person's perspective. This means making it clear that it's important for you to understand their beliefs, fears, and needs. Second, explaining your perspective. This includes sharing what you think might help and explaining why you think that it might help, and agreeing on a plan together. So this means having an open discussion in which you can go back and forth, sharing opinions and your expertise. So could I get a confirmation that you guys can still see me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. So we're gonna go on to video 5 here. This is a recreation of a mental health encounter in which the practitioner sort of ends up pressuring this young man to resume his prescribed antidepressants. So Luke was prescribed antidepressants earlier in the month, but he did stop taking them because he felt that they made him more anxious. With that, I'm just going to go ahead and play.
Do you want to try and address your mood?
What do you mean?
Do you want it to be different from what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah? So what do you need to start doing?
Taking tablets.
Yeah. Because what dose did you say you thought it was?
20 milligram.
20. You need to give it a go, Luke.
All right, that was a pretty quick one. I'm going to ask everybody again. It's been such a great conversation so far. I've been reading the chat along the whole way. If everyone can go into the chat and again comment just with your initial feelings about the video. And then looking more closely at the transcript, I'm going to kind of speed through this due to time, but we can see that the practitioner does treat Luke as already having the tools he needs to improve his mental health. And we see also that she does not ask for his perspective or about his concerns or the reasons that he might have stopped taking the medication, and doesn't end up learning until much later in the assessment why it was that he stopped taking his antidepressants. Again, in the interest of time, I hope you guys kind of keep commenting on the comments about that first video, but I am going to move on to video 6. So here we're going to see an example in which the practitioner asks for the young person's perspective on attending grief counseling. So Sam is a young man who's presented after a suicide attempt, but his mother has recently passed away. And I think it is important, kind of before I start the video, to mention that these aren't examples of perfect practice. I think this is something that Gemma brought up as well. But our goal is to share real interactions and use that to sort of prompt conversation together. So there are definitely some positives, I think, to this interaction, but again, it's not going to be perfect. So, just before this, Sam has been talking about his difficulty coping with his mother's death, and that's the context in which the practitioner is going to bring up the possibility of grief counseling.
On the subject of your mum, have you ever had any counselling, any grief counselling or around loss of a family member? No. Has anyone ever suggested it to you?
The mental health team did in London. They suggested counseling for me.
Okay. What do you think about that?
It's just talking about it. I just don't want to keep doing. But it upsets me.
I don't want to feel upset. I don't want to talk about my mom.
Okay.
So I think a key point here to know before going in and starting the chat is that ultimately this practitioner is able to use this young man's kind of description of what he wants and needs and what he's not comfortable doing to recommend cognitive behavioral therapy. And she describes that as a type of therapy where you can focus on how you feel right now rather than on past traumas. And that in this case, the young man is able to respond to that really positively. So again, comment on the Zoom chat. How does it make you feel watching this video here? What are your first impressions? And again, in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to skip ahead. And I am going to turn things over to Rachel, if that's okay, and our third panel.
Okay, back to our panel. Thanks, Clara. So Nusaybah, I'm coming back to you with this question. So what advice do you have for professionals to better involve young people in decisions?
So I think it's really important for the professionals to equip the young people with all the information they need to know in order to be able to make decisions that they feel are best for them. And I think sometimes professionals might think that the young people might already know this, or that is just basic, but that might not always be the case. I think to also deliver it in a way that isn't belittling them as well, because they might not know everything, but also don't treat them like they know nothing. And I think be supportive of their decisions. If they choose to go down this route or that route, I think it's important for the professionals to be like, okay, and do what they can to support them in that particular journey that they've chosen, or that method of being helped, and treat them as a partner, see it as a team where both parties are involved, and to also remember that it's their life. It might just be part of your job, but it's their life and they have to deal with that. You might be able to go home at the end of the day, but it's constant for them. And if in very particular situations they might be deemed as too unwell and too unable to make decisions for themselves, I think in cases like that it's still important to inform them to just keep them in the know and not go behind their back. Perhaps inform them of why you've chosen to make that decision, and asking them how they feel about it, taking into account their thoughts and feelings and their wishes and wants.
Perfect, thank you, Nusaybah. It's good to see some of the comments aligning as well, because I know Gemma mentioned earlier about, working very much as a partnership, supporting that young person on that journey. Okay, cool. I will go to my next panelist. So Richard, this question's for you. What questions should professionals be asking young people to really involve them in decisions?
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'd like to talk about a couple of things in terms of decision making. One of them is the relationship with diagnosis, and personally, I'm more inclined to support a young person to think about what's going on for them in their life and have that general formulation rather than diagnosis, mainly because I think it helps lead to increase in agency, because often it's by understanding one's life that you can really think about what can change. And this is a really tricky area of navigating between supporting an individual to change themselves and putting some of the responsibility on an individual, and a paternalistic view of let's give someone a treatment because I know what's best. And it's a really tricky area. So helping and asking someone about what's going on for them and creating a whole person formulation is really important, and then embedding goals in that. So what are the goals and what are the ones that you would want to address? And they may be tiny, and that's absolutely fine, because you don't want to set yourself up to fail as a practitioner by setting the bar too high so someone feels really bad about failing. But equally, you don't want to set the bar too low so that there's a kind of low expectation. I think the other side of it is really knowing that you don't know as a practitioner what's going to make a difference, and suggesting things might be helpful a little bit, but often the individual will be able to come up with the answers much better because they know their life and their context. So when it comes to psychosocial issues, they are going to know what might make a difference. They don't know for certain, but they might have a good clue about what might make a difference and what they're prepared to change. So that's really important, and what might have helped in the past. So really it's eliciting their knowledge about what might make a difference given their whole situation. The second area I just want to touch on is where we go back to medication. And yes, that was an appalling transcript you showed, in my view. I think when it comes to medication and treatments, that's where you get into the professional knowledge domain. And really, it's very hard for young people and anybody to understand what's going on with something like antidepressants. Actually, most practitioners and most scientists still don't know what's happening. I've gone through a transition of from initially conning people by saying you'll probably be better if you take antidepressants, knowing that wasn't a lie, but it was only a half truth, to thinking actually that antidepressants only work a little bit on average. So it's pretty irrelevant whether you take them. I'm actually more now on the camp of Joanne Moncrief, which is that antidepressants are psychoactive substances that can have quite different effects on different people, and we don't know what effect they will have on individuals. And the 2 week till it gets better is a lie when you're talking about an individual. That's just an average effect size. So explaining to somebody that actually this could have an impact on how you empathize and feel about things. Now that might be good if you want to get rid of some feelings, but it might not be good if you want to be engaging with your child or your partner. So think about the effect it's having on you. Similarly, it might have an activating effect. And it sounds like the young person in the interview, it had an activating effect on their thoughts, which was not very nice. We know that antidepressants can have an activating effect and cause problems. And so people need to be aware of that and then respond to that on an individual basis. Sorry, I went on a bit.
That's perfect. Thank you, Richard. So treating people like an individual is mostly what I picked up from there, which is really helpful. I'm going to jump on to the final panelist, and this one's for Sajda. So my question is, what changes can teachers and schools make to give young people the tools to really involve them in decisions about their mental health?
I think it's really important before we start even thinking about any kind of clinical or medical model that we remember that young people have significant other adults in their life that need to be part of their decision making, part of their well-being. So it's really important that schools build up those relationships with parents and carers of those young people, and really encourage a real joint up approach to the care plan that's in place for that young person as well. Parents need to believe that schools have a sense of responsibility and will guide the young person towards making the right choices for them. But also parents have a responsibility to start to challenge and tackle alongside the schools some of the stigma and discrimination that young people face when they start talking about mental health. So I think it's really important that we think about relationships, we think about communities and building up a community around a young person, thinking about, again, looking at those protective factors and connecting with those providers of those sort of services in the community to enable a young person, again, to access support. The other thing around schools is also to ensure that, we've heard before, a couple of colleagues have talked about supervision, is also to ensure that staff who are dealing with young people or supporting young people who are presenting with poor mental health or having sort of mental health experiences around suicide thoughts or self-harm, that we also put something into place to support staff. Because if they feel supported, they're better placed to support young people. They're also better placed to model some of that self-care and promote some of those protective factors for themselves, so that, again, they can really be advocates for young people and parents in terms of self-care and accessing those community-based organisations before it becomes statutory services that they get engaged with.
Perfect, Sajda. I think some really important points there. Thank you to all of the panellists. I will hand back to Clara now to share some top tips with us.
I'm still on mute. Thank you so much to Rachel and all of our panelists. That was really wonderful. I just have a few final points here. We have a few top tips from our Young People's Advisory Group. For one thing, just starting off, it was seen as really critical that essentially involving a person in decisions centrally involves explaining what it is that you recommend based on your experience and understanding, so that the young person is then empowered to make an informed decision. So this coming directly from our Young People's Advisory Group, that it's not that involving a young person in decisions doesn't just mean turning to them and saying, what do you want? It involves a lot of kind of back and forth and conversation and explaining your perspective and what you think could be best. Second off, it's really key to ask questions and make sure that the young person knows that you are genuinely interested in understanding their perspective. So in particular, like more specifically, essentially this involves asking the young person if they've heard about or tried this treatment option before. It also involves asking what their concerns might be about treatment and discussing these before you get into actually moving towards that decision. Third, many of our young people described feeling that their practitioner had already made up their mind about treatment before explaining what that treatment was. So in particular, the young people in our YPAG described these instances as particularly memorable just because they felt so removed from the treatment decision-making in those moments. Fourth, as we mentioned before, people describe not wanting practitioners to simply ask what treatment they think they need. So it was clearly preferred to discuss the treatment option together, with both the young person and the practitioner sharing their knowledge and coming to the decision as a team. And finally, it was really important to be transparent about what possible problems or side effects, that it was better to have some understanding of the whole picture at the beginning before going into it than running into unexpected problems later and potentially losing trust in services or in treatments because of those very early experiences.